must be better than me. Understand?
Long way from home, aren't you?
What would you do if you had a second chance? Are we condemned to repeat the past? Or can we forge a new identity for ourselves? Why am I asking you these philosophical questions? Well, it's kind of at the heart of what the new God of War is about. The God of War franchise is both highly acclaimed and heavily criticized. On the one hand, it's this brilliant high fantasy adventure, a romp through Greek mythology that is both engaging and captivating. On the other hand, it is criticized for being vulgar and violent in ways that, let's face it, is kind of distasteful. In an era where games are eagerly trying to prove themselves as a viable art form, it's easy to see why the game is so polarizing. Is there a way for us to bridge this divide? With the latest iteration of the Spartan warrior saga being heralded as a step forward for a maturing medium, perhaps we can take a step back to see how Kratos' revival compares to the old trilogy. What we find is an earnest attempt to redeem an iconic character, perhaps a game that foreshadows where gaming might be going in the future.
Now it is yours. The gods of Olympus have abandoned me.
God of War tells the story of an ambitious young captain in the Spartan army whose life centers around destroying his foes. Despite his single-minded desire for fame and prestige, not to mention his propensity for violence, let's say. Kratos fails to realize his ambition.
Once a captain in the Spartan army, Kratos had begun his command with only 50 soldiers. But soon his numbers grew to the thousands. His tactics were brutal, but effective.
Unwilling to accept this, Kratos beseeches the god of war, Ares, to come to his aid.
Ares!
Unfortunately, to solicit his aid, he kinda has to sell his soul to accomplish this, but I guess what else is a career-minded Spartan general to do? From top to bottom, God of War is, narratively speaking, effectively a Greek tragedy. For those unfamiliar, a Greek tragedy features an accomplished individual with specific goals and dreams, but in the pursuit of those aims uses less than savory means to fulfill them. Sometimes the circumstances of their downfall are entirely out of their control, which sucks for them, but it forces us to confront the nature of fate and agency itself. There's often a strict moral calculus in these stories, and a reckoning for heroes who violate certain norms. We feel both pity and revile them, leaving us a little conflicted about their plight. Kratos pledges himself to Ares, and uses this Faustian deal to ransack, murder, and destroy all his enemies. However, his bloodthirsty lust leads him to kill his own family. A horrifying act of this scale is sometimes referred to as a dark turn, a moral line that should not be crossed, but is one that seals the fate of our protagonist. Being the petty man that he is, he blames his actions on the war god Ares, and then promptly attempts to murder him with the aid of Pandora's box. Fortunately, this does not provide him the peace he seeks. A warrior of the skill, strength, and bravado of Kratos is reduced to this remorseful, conflicted mess, highlighting the severity of his transgressions. Kratos is haunted by his actions, and at the end of the first game, attempts to commit suicide to escape his nightmares.
And Kratos cast himself from the highest mountain in all of Greece. After 10 years of suffering, 10 years of endless nightmares, it would finally come to an end. Death would be his escape from madness.
If this is where the story ended, it would have been a fairly poetic, tragic arc. But they had to kinda make 2 sequels. Now being resentful towards the other gods for his plight, and Zeus for being a manipulative dick, he then murders them all, including pretty much anything in his vicinity.
It was I who made you a god, Ghost of Sparta. Do not turn your back on me.
I owe you nothing.
Then you leave me no choice.
Kratos had turned the pain of his memories into hatred. Hatred for the gods, who had refused to free him from the nightmares of his past deeds. And so he went to Rhodes to deliver the final blow to the besieged city.
Say what you will about the overt, unrestrained nature of the violence, the mechanics of the original trilogy were perfectly aligned with Kratos, whose blood-soaked vendetta against all those who have wronged him is fairly consistent with the power fantasy embodied in the gameplay. We revel in the carnage along with Kratos, and the borderline pornographic violence is framed by camera angles and gameplay that reinforce the sensation. The characterization of Kratos is also on point, and we practically see the rage, vengefulness, and madness seeping through him. The games were all expertly paced spectacles, with brilliant set-piece design, fluid combat, and a kinetic sense of adventure. However, when we look at the plot, the gameplay doesn't really reinforce the themes. To understand why, we have to examine a couple of ways tragedies tend to conclude. One way a tragedy can end is with what is called a redemption arc. This is an instance where a character who might have committed some indiscretion in the past finds a way to make amends, atone for his sins, and reconcile with those he's wronged. A somewhat contrived example of this is, say, Beauty and the Beast, where this narcissistic prince spurns an old woman from his castle and is turned into a beast for being a dick. To break the curse, he has to find a way to have someone fall in love with him for who he is on the inside in ways he never afforded others in the past. This poetic symmetry tasks the hero with overcoming his specific shortcoming and transforming himself into someone worthy of love. By proving himself in the eyes of Belle, he finds redemption. The other way these stories end is with the eventual demise of the character. They just double down on the path of destruction they've set before themselves and find no way of pulling back from the brink. This usually happens when there's no self-reflection, self-improvement, or beautiful maiden who forces you to reconsider, and ends in all kinds of bad ways for our protagonist. Oedipus Rex kills his father and marries his mother, albeit inadvertently, and ends up blinding himself by the end. Anna Karenina commits infidelity out of repression, boredom, and curiosity, and then promptly commits suicide. A more modern take of this story, one which I won't spoil, so don't worry, is Breaking Bad. It's the story of a cancer-ridden chemistry teacher turned drug dealer who, with the noblest of intentions, gets involved in the world of organized crime to provide for his family. You can trace and predict the structure of these kinds of plots and how closely they follow either a tragic spiral or a redemption arc. The fun comes from trying to predict which way it'll go. Why am I telling you all this? Well, God of War's initial trilogy did something interesting in that it tried to tie both these endings together, but in the end it did neither. Kratos tried killing himself at the end of the first game, suggesting a sober realization of his past actions, but the gods prevented it, condemning him to a life of Sisyphean irony by having him oversee all wars through history as the new god of war. Poetic punishment, right?
Of the man who had defeated a god. They were driven forward by Kratos, the mortal who had become the new god of war.
However, this sets him off on a quest to kill the gods, doubling down on his faults if I ever heard of it. All through these games, you continue to be prompted, as the player, to enable Kratos' violent fetish for deicide, all for the sake of your own entertainment. The player is complicit in this fantasy, as fun as it may be, yet somehow the creators could not commit to a particular ending. By the end of the third game, Kratos kills himself, to bequeath humanity with hope, a seemingly noble task, right after both he and you, the player, have spent the best part of 3 games doing nothing but indulging your anger, killing all of Greek mythology, and condemning humanity in the first place. By the end, it's clear that Kratos is just a vehicle for player fantasy, and his own arc is subordinate to ours. What that says about us is a little discomforting, but we'll get to that later. This shoehorned redemptive ending feels forced and unearned, and the character vapid and incomplete at first. Fast forward to the latest God of War, and Kratos, somehow surviving, has tried to put some distance between himself and his past. The creative director Cory Barlog has stated in interviews how he chose the Scandinavian wastelands of Norse mythology as it provided a sense of isolation to stage Kratos' comeback. A blank slate, if you will. What's also changed is Kratos now has a son, an innocent youth untainted by the sins of his father. The game sees them voyaging to the top of the highest peak in the lands to bury the ashes of Kratos' recently deceased wife. This gives the game room to explore Kratos and his son's evolving relationship, a journey that is both physical and psychological. Immediately, we see the inklings of a newly conceived redemptive awakening. with the son stepping in as a surrogate for the narrative device that Belle played in Beauty and the Beast. You know, that person you have to impress and prove yourself in the eyes of if you want redemption. What was noticeable to me is that the addition of a child that you presumably have to protect immediately recontextualizes any violence you may be forced to commit. It's no longer a sadistic indulgence, but becomes an instrumental part of protecting your child. Yeah, the game is still over the top in its violence, but at least they're trying to justify some of the actions.
Let him go!
Also, the gameplay maps onto this as well. The violence is brutal but methodical now. Vicious but necessary. It's more deliberately paced as opposed to being button mashy as the initial game, which allowed for a lot of collateral damage. This is a nice way to emphasize the story beats. Maybe this time we can actually earn some of that redemption Kratos so desperately seeks, both in story and through our gameplay. Kratos still has many of the disagreeable quirks that characterized him in the first trilogy. He's still reticent, grumpy, short-tempered, and sullen. Much of this carries over into how he parents Atreus. Kratos is infinitely pragmatic. He has no patience for the boundless curiosity of youth his son has. We notice that he no longer kills unless it's necessary as well, and he actively restrains his violent impulses should they arise. He's also concerned with not having his son see him at his worst, for reasons that are quite common in fiction. His son is a chance for his vicarious redemption, a way to end the cycle of patricide he, his father Zeus, and his father Kronos have set in motion. Atreus is a metaphor, in some sense, for Kratos' own redemption, and hence it's important how the game frames their interactions, the gameplay, and both Kratos' and Atreus' character arcs to highlight this.
And he needs his father.
As their voyage progresses, Kratos and Atreus come to understand one another better, and build a rapport that Kratos' absenteeism in the past never afforded. This is mirrored in the gameplay. As Kratos levels up, the son's abilities also improve, and combat becomes this tango between father and son. Atreus is capable, never gets in the way of combat, and the player actively incorporates his abilities into the flow. Having the mechanical synchronicity of the combat and the harmonizing of Kratos and his son as characters align is a nice touch, and reinforces what they're trying to tell through the story.
Smells like rotten eggs. Is it still good?
Possibly.
Kratos himself loosens up through the voyage, thanks in no small part to his son's optimism and compassion. However, Atreus picks up some of Kratos' quirks, including his indifference towards others, his rage towards the gods, and delusions of invulnerability.
No.
But we're gods.
It's at this point most players probably went, "God, that little brat."
We won't.
That's what I said to your mother right before I gave it to her.
The entire game is filmed in a single shot, a move driven by a need to highlight the intimacy between father and son, and to propel us into their shoes. And it worked extremely well.
I'm fine, see?
Kratos learns to respect his son's independent will, and stops viewing him as an inconvenience. He also continues to care about him, despite his son's betrayal. And given his prior penchant for violence and doing away with people who have betrayed him, this is actual earnest growth.
I killed my father.
The final reckoning for the story is Kratos being able to accept himself for who he is, overcoming his demons, and perhaps most importantly, confessing his sins to his son. He finally comes to understand what he was in the past, and uses this to frame how he will be in the future. Through this, and the characters coming together as one,
No.
he earns some of that redemption he so desperately
We will
seeks.
be the gods we choose to be. Not those who have been.
There's nowhere you can hide, Spartan. Put as much distance between you and the truth as you want. It changes nothing. Pretend to be everything you are not. Teacher, husband, father. But there is one unavoidable truth you will never escape. You cannot change. You will always be a monster.
I know. But I am your monster no longer.
Something strange popped out at me as I was playing through the game. The way Kratos tries to help and teach his son through the game mirrors how games themselves try to teach us as players. Bear with me for a second. Think of it like this. Every time we enter a new game, whether something as whimsical as Mario or as macabre as God of War, we are effectively set free into a new world, and are tasked with learning the mechanics, systems, and quirks of a particular game. We are, effectively, children, every time we enter a new world, and game designers have to come up with a whole host of methods to aid our initiation into their realms. There are button prompts, heavy tutorialization, and the famous walkie-talkie bits where people guide you in heavy-handed ways. Games as a medium are, in some really weird sense, teaching tools. But they teach us how we ought to be teaching.
Hold! What are you doing? Now his guard is up. Only fire! Only fire.
As we play Kratos, who is guiding Atreus through this harsh Norse world, the game is teaching us as Kratos about its world. We, the players, are learning just as Kratos and Atreus are to become better versions of ourselves. Kratos' parenting style is interesting to take note of, as he's initially of the mind that Atreus is not really ready for the journey. But he yields as necessity dictates action. Atreus has to learn on the job, as it were, confronting violence and hardship as they present themselves. This precisely mirrors how we as game players have to learn on the fly, tackling an ever-increasing set of obstacles on our way to the game's conclusion.
You are not ready.
Games trust us to examine their world as natural philosophers, or children do, which is to learn about systems in a tactile, on-hand, and instantly gratifying way. There's always oversight, the way Kratos lingers over his son as he progresses, but there's also trust. To use an example, in our hunter-gatherer past, anthropologists argue that children were allowed to play freely with their environment, as this was the most engaging and efficient way of having them learn. In fact, there are tribes in Papua New Guinea today where ethnographers are stunned by how parents don't fret as their children play with darts, knives, and fire. Today, schools are designed to routinize, regiment, and reorganize children's minds for industrial efficiency, and parents seem to be encroaching more and more on children's freedom. It's no wonder that children want to play games as opposed to be in school, because it's in games where they confront systems that trust them to learn for themselves, just as Kratos does with Atreus. Recall what redemption entails. It's about learning from your past inadequacies and indiscretions and becoming a better version of yourself. Lovey-dovey stuff. Atreus does this on the job. Kratos does it by burying his past and paving the way for a better future. And we do it every time we enter a new game and learn. But that's just competence, right? The redemption arc always has moral connotations. Just as Atreus serves as a metaphor for Kratos' redemption, we serve as a metaphor for how the medium itself is transforming. We expect our games to have more serious subject matter, nuanced themes, and a deeper purpose to the actions we engage in. God of War tries to rehabilitate a character that many considered irredeemable, tries to recontextualize violence in a way that makes sense for the purposes of the narrative, and does a great job of reinvigorating the failed redemption arc of initial trilogy. By having our actions subordinate to Kratos as opposed to the other way, the game itself becomes a medium to tell a story, as opposed to emboldening us to live out a fantasy. The narrative, the gameplay, and the medium of games all folded onto one another, in ways that highlights the parallels between them. Games can help facilitate learning, because what they are fundamentally is teaching tools. Some people are irked that games are starting to become too user-friendly and over-tutorialized. And as a person who loves Dark Souls, my initial reaction is to agree. God of War is not exempt from this. However, games are becoming much more commonplace, which requires we accommodate those new to the medium. A maturing medium entails a broader audience, which means you'll have people who don't share the same games literacy as some of us. Additionally, there's also a huge debate in games about whether we should emphasize gameplay or narrative. And there are many fans of the older games that are perturbed by the, let's say, less complex mechanics of the new God of War. Contextualizing narrative is great, but many argue some things are lost when we put gameplay in the service of story instead of the other way around. You know what? These people have a point. And some games can just be about unadulterated fun as opposed to tackling mature subject matter. We should be able to accommodate all these types of games instead of becoming a monolithic medium, and judge games based on what they're trying to accomplish themselves. It's curious how pervasive the narrative-based escort mission has become, with games like BioShock Infinite, The Last of Us, and God of War all dealing with themes of fatherhood, responsibility, and redemption. This might be a sign of creators who want there to be more meaning to their games, or an increasing amount of fathers in the medium. However, I think they're still a little conflicted about how much to cede to the story versus the gameplay. To really hit home on the theme of contextualizing violence by protecting one's child, the game could have had Atreus being vulnerable to death, but instead, it opts for an invulnerable sidekick to quell players' irritability towards escort characters. In this case, they sided with gameplay, when I think the narrative would have been better served with us being concerned with his well-being more directly. For a better example, the game Eco did a spectacular job at this, as in that game, your character doesn't actually have a health bar. Failure instead is determined by the Princess Yorda you're escorting, and whether she's captured. The players have to desperately claw at getting her back from the brink, which makes us care more about her than ourselves. Another example is Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons. That game uses the conflict in the mechanics, where you have to use two different thumbs to control two different brothers, to emphasize the narrative theme of brothers butting heads with one another. God of War might have benefited from employing some of these narrative devices, being more committed to the story in this sense, but I get why they didn't do it.
You do not know everything, boy.
No. But at least I know the truth now.
The truth. The truth.
God of War is an excellent game, that goes without saying. Not only is it fantastic technical achievement, it's also a well-told tale bolstered by its mechanics. What's more interesting is what it says about where our medium is, the themes we are collectively confronting, and where we might be going in the future. We are still struggling to justify actions in games, while we simultaneously want complex systems decoupled from narrative, because that's why we play games to begin with. The new God of War tries to reconcile these things. The fact that one of the most gratuitous cases of indulging player fantasy, through the avatar of Kratos, has been successfully rehabilitated as a character-driven story, with a well-realized character who redeems his own redemptive arc, is a testament to the depth our medium has accumulated over the years. Being honest with ourselves, we're all Kratos in some sense, and I'm curious where games can take us as a medium, just as this game has taken Kratos.
Goodbye, Faye.
I love you, Mom.